Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Ciara Breathnach, and I am a senior lecturer in the Department of History at the University of Limerick. I would like to introduce you to my project, which is entitled Death and Burial Data Ireland 1864 to 1922, or DBD IRL. Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Ciara Breathnach, and I am a senior lecturer in history at the University of Limerick. And I would like to introduce you to my project, which is entitled Death and Burial Data Ireland 1864 to 1922. The aim of my project is to look at historical big data and try to create some new knowledge from it. The aim of the project is to create prosopographies or mini biographies of ordinary lives, and that then in turn can help us to perhaps conduct studies of disease mapping in Ireland. But ultimately, what it helps us to do is it helps us to understand how biopower accrued in Ireland. Biopower is a concept that was first devised by Michel Foucault, who was a philosopher and historian, and he first mooted the concept of biopower, or the way the state creates little machines, if you will, of ways in which it can control the populace. One of the ways in which the sovereign or the state can control the populace is by the simple matter of counting the people, both living and dead. That in turn can occur through civil registration processes or perhaps census returns. These form the basis for taxation, but also for things like public health planning, education systems, and infrastructure planning. In the Irish context, it's an interesting construct because, of course, Ireland was neither a colony nor a kingdom. It was part of the United Kingdom at the time, from 1801 to 1922, but a reluctant part of that kingdom, of a not so United Kingdom. The majority of the population in Ireland would have been Roman Catholic. If you look at an all island perspective, in the 1880s or 1890s, for example, something in the region of 75 to 76% of the population of the whole island professed as Roman Catholic. The power brokerage was primarily in the hands of the Anglican faiths, which comprised something in the region of about 25%, sorry, maybe around 23-24% of the population. In 1922, when the Irish Free State was formed, the population of the 26 counties of Ireland were professing, sorry, my apologies, 96% of the population of the 26 counties professed as Roman Catholic. So you begin to see the regionalisation of religion in Ireland and the problems that actually caused as well. So with that in mind, the historical data have overarching problems associated with the ways in which the data themselves were collected, and I would like for you to bear that in mind as we go on to discuss the other data problems. This project uses various different types of structured and unstructured data, that some of which are available freely online, some of which is legacy data from previously funded projects. But the primary data that this project uses is death data, death registration data. And that first began in Ireland in 1864, the collation of that data. And I would consider this big data. The data itself belongs to the General Registrar's Office of Ireland, and we're very grateful to the GRO for lending us the data for the project. They gave us the data in two different file formats. First, a very large Excel file of 4.3 million entries and TIFFs corresponding with the entries. The TIFFs are actually photographs of original registration pages, and I'll speak about that in a moment. But I think that in all, the data dump that we got constitutes most certainly big data. Big data is defined as more data that you can read without the aid of a machine. So we have only received the death registration from the GRO. That is civil registration data, and it is contained on also on the Irish Genealogy website, which is a government funded project. That website also has parish records. I mentioned earlier that Irish people had a complicated relationship with biopower in Ireland for religious reasons, and which unfortunately at times became sectarian reasons in Ireland throughout the 19th and early 20th century, and eventually resulted in the partition of Ireland in 1920 under the Government of Ireland Act, which created the six counties of Northern Ireland. And then in 1922, we had the formation of the Irish Free State. I would argue that births, deaths, and marriage data can help us to, I suppose, determine a life course in Ireland. But for many Irish people, there are no civil registration records because they simply did not recognise the civil registration powers in Ireland. So that's why parish records are also quite important, and these religious records can also provide the parameters of a life course. So the second column there, if you will, of siloed data is available on another government website, the National Archives website. And again, this is an enormous data set which details the census of Ireland from 1901 and again in 1911. And I would consider these data, if you combine them together or provide ways of linking them, as life grid data. Say, for example, you have somebody born in Ireland whose birth might have been registered in the 1890s. You'll find them in the census in 1901 with any luck. You might be able to determine who their parents were, who their siblings were, and then you might be able to also examine where they were in 1911, and also you might be able to link that data back to the marriage data. So there are ways in which we can use these little snippets of ordinary lives to be able to create these prosopographies, these elusive prosopographies that I am in search of. Third data type that we have as historians are life event data, and these can be gleaned, these are much smaller data types, much smaller data sets. Medical legal data would fall under that rubric to my mind. Newspaper reports of violent death, for example, or coroner's inquest reports, or other registers that can provide life event data. For example, there are other miscellaneous data sets out there, or smaller data of burial records that have been crowdsourced. For Limerick, for example, there's a great crowdsourcing project for the historical local cemetery there. There's also poor law union records that have been digitized by various different funded academic projects over the years. Prison records are also miscellaneous data sets that are out there, as are migration and shipping lists that have again been crowdsourced, and school records have also been crowdsourced data that can be used to verify the other different types of structured and unstructured data that we have access to. As you can see here, if we put all of these things together, what we can do is create prosopography and linked data for ordinary lives. Civil registration was introduced to Ireland in 1864, and as I mentioned earlier, Ireland was part of an unhappy union with the rest of the United Kingdom, which had introduced modern civil registration in England and Wales in 1837. The Scottish were not too happy with it either because, remember, at the foot of all of this is possibility for increased taxation and government surveillance. And of course, the poor were always suspicious of any mechanism which counted bodies, both living and dead. Civil registration was introduced to Scotland in 1854 and into Ireland in 1864. Um, an act was introduced in Ireland in 1844 to register non Catholic marriage, but of course, as I mentioned also earlier, not the majority of the Irish population were in fact Roman Catholic, so they would have been excluded from that earlier data set. The data was collected by using dispensary doctors who became registrars. And these registrars collated data and reported uh, quarterly to their superintendent registrar's district. We'll see an example of that in a moment in terms of the data that was collected. And each of these superintendent registrars' districts would then forward their information to the Registrar General, whose purpose was to collate all of the national data and produce an annual report for Parliament. That annual report would detail all births, deaths, and marriages in Ireland, and of course, this formed the basis of any kind of public health planning. Here's an example of the interface that you will see when you are looking at irishgenealogy.ie. As you will see, it's broken down by name, by year of death. You get a group registration ID, which is unique to that individual. It's unique to this woman, Bridget Fadian, who died in the Westport Superintendent Registration District in 1897. And here we can see her age at death. But the searchability of these data is actually quite limited. As you can see on the left panel there, you can only search by name, which means you actually have to have a name. You also have to have the registration district, but in actual fact, this woman, Bridget Fadian, was from Achill Island. And again, you have to have a rough idea of the year of death. If you click on the image behind that search interface, you'll see that the image will bring you to a much more detailed form. And on this form, we have the breakdown, the geographical breakdown. As you can see in the top right hand corner there, the registrar's district is actually Achill, and it's in the county of Mayo. And obviously, being able to break the data down that little bit further is very, very useful for the purposes of historical inquiry. Another thing that's worth looking at here as well is that the interface doesn't allow us to look at things that I'm interested in, which is the cause of death data. And in this particular year, there was a maternal mortality crisis on the island of Achill, and there were several maternal deaths that occurred. And what was interesting for me was when I examined a run of data from Achill Island, I isolated the data associated with women of reproductive age. We found that once a nurse was introduced to the island, that maternal mortality pretty much disappeared. So that's why it's actually quite important to collate data like this, because it gives us an idea of how we can manage things like public health planning. So here's an example of the form that registrars were asked to populate in the event of a death. As you can see at the top here, there's deaths registered in the district of, in the union of, in the county of, and that would be actually contained on every individual sheet. Each registrar's book contained the possibility of registering 10 deaths on that page. And British administration was very good at actually creating unique identifiers for people. But when we were given these data, this large data or big data from the General Registrar's Office of Ireland, which we're very grateful for, we were provided with an Excel file of 4.3 million deaths and the associated TIFs. So if you can recollect the previous on the previous slide, each uh, individual entry has a TIF behind it, but each individual entry also has a very unique identifier associated with it, which I'll speak more about in a moment. There are some problems associated with the way in which the original Act asked the various different registrars to collate the data. As you would see here, there are about 11 different columns here, and each of the columns actually contains alphanumerical data, which of course various different computer programs do not like. Access has no problem with alphanumerical data being combined with one another, but unfortunately Excel does. I should add as well that the digitisation of these data began in 1997, and it's important to remember that we are dealing here with legacy data. When we received the data dump of the big data from the GRO, we received an Excel file of 4.3 million deaths, which of course had to be broken down because Excel does not cope very well with uh, anything more than a million. And it was very difficult to search those data. And it was populated to just a very small degree. We had a group registration ID for everybody. We had the name, the surname, and the forename, and we also had a TIFF file. And basically, the type of data that was gleaned for the purposes of the digitisation project and the indexing of the data was to enable it to be, I suppose, searchable to a degree whereby the GRO could provide a copy of a historical death registration to the public. So it was actually quite limited. And when we started looking at the data that little bit more closely, one thing that's actually has always been very clear to me is that there are three individuals involved in the transaction of registering a death. There is the person who is at the center of the life event, the person who is deceased. Then there is the informant who takes that information or registers the information with the local registrar, who is the local doctor. All well and good. But when we looked at the data that little bit further and broke it down into its alpha and numerical data type, what we found was 26 different elements in which we could break the data into. And in fact, there's more if somebody had, say, a complex cause of death, if there was a couple of say, for example, they had influenza for 10 days, but prior to that, they had bronchial pneumonia for perhaps 2 years before that. Then the cause of death and the duration of illness would be separated out, obviously. But what if there was a third cause of death indicated? Then that would create another two columns from our basic 26 here. So as you can see with this form, what we did was we initially fleshed out the original Excel that we received. We fleshed out the various different columns or the ontologies under which we could actually categorize the data. And of course, with the ultimate aim of making these data that little bit more searchable and useful for analysis, both from a data analytics perspective, but also from the perspective of historical disease mapping. again, there are three different people associated with um, the data that is contained in a historical death registration. You have the dead person, the informant, and the registrar. And associated with each of these individuals, we have various different attributes. You'll have the name and surname of the deceased person and their sex. Then you have the informant, and you have then attributes that are associated with them. They provide information as to whether or not um, they were present at death, the cause of death, the duration of illness, the date, and the place of death. The registrar then is tasked with another set of attributes of the data associated with the administration of the death. Also associated with the dead person are things like their gender and their occupation, and you may or may not have information surrounding the informant as to whether or not they had a qualification or indeed that they were co-resident with the informant. There are certain things that we need to have in order for a death to be legally registered, and they're contained in this mapping here. But of course, I think that there's a lot more that we can do with these data. I'm very grateful for your thoughts and your imagination with regards to using AI to render further details or ways of thinking about or tools to examine or to analyze these data. And I'm available to uh, discuss these data with you. If you'd like to email me, my email is ciara.brannock@ul.ie. I'm very grateful to you all for your time. The final slide has a few websites that may or may not be useful to you in formulating your thoughts around this exercise for the MSc in AI. Thank you all very much for your time.